Today we have with us Ms. Sherri Goodman. She served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Environmental Secretary in the US from 1993 to 2001. She has founded the CNA Military Advisory Board on Climate Change and National Security in 2007, and now chairs the Council on Strategic Risks, including its Center for Climate and Security, and is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute. Thank you for being here with us today.
Delighted to be with you.
Just to introduce us, I am Prashasti. I am a working group member from the King's think tank, and interviewing with me today is...
I'm Matthew, and I'm also I'm the editor, but it means I'm part of the working group for the Policy Center, for the Defense Policy Policy Center of the King's think tank.
Great. So let's begin. And let's start with the most common yet important question. Ms. Goodman, what do you think is the greatest threat arising from climate change in today's world?
Well, climate change acts as a threat multiplier, augmenting other threats that we see around the world, from great power competition to illegal fishing, to conflict and instability and disputes, food and water insecurity that we see around the world. So in the near term, the great threats that we are facing are a combination of extreme heat and water risks, either too much water, floods, more damaging storms and hurricanes, and cyclones, or too little water in certain parts of the globe, extended drought, that we know has led to widespread food and water insecurity and fueled the global wave of migration that we are feeling across the planet now.
Great. And according to you, when did governments start taking climate change seriously as a security risk?
If indeed they have.
They have, yeah, I know.
Well, in the United States, when we released the first CNA Military Advisory Board report in 2007, April of 2007, that coincided with the first UN deliberation on climate as a security risk. That occurred in April of 2007, and at the same time, the United States Congress adopted several of our key recommendations in the defense bill for that year, including that the U.S. national security strategy, national defense strategy, national military strategy, and intelligence assessments should include the national security implications of climate change. So that's been now almost a decade and a half. And I would say as of today, we now have an international military council on climate security that includes over 35 countries represented, national security and military leaders. So there's growing and widespread recognition by countries in every continent today that this is an increasingly important part of our national and international security.
Very fair. But despite that, I've been looking around a bit, and while there's some great policy work, as I'm sure you're familiar with, on climate change and security, there isn't much academic work. There's only, I counted, less than 50 sort of journal articles about it in the past 25 years. I was wondering if you had any views on sort of why this is, and potentially how we can change it and get more academic interest as well as policy interest on the subject.
Well, you all are right there at the ground level. I think this is a growing field. The field, I would broaden it to include environmental security, a field that is now almost a quarter century old. The Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center, which was one of the first, which was founded at the time that I was serving as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and in the early 90s, in the early post-Cold War period, was really the first era where there was a great deal of focus on natural security elements, environmental degradation, ocean health, biodiversity, and including climate change. Now, those elements, I see increasing, obviously there's a lot of scientific literature in all of those fields, and you could break that down. And there's growing sort of peace and conflict and security studies literature. There's the Planetary Security Initiative, which links with many other think tanks around the planet, and that's just one example. So it's a newer field, but that means there's opportunities for other scholars to contribute to growing this field.
Something I think a lot of our readers and listeners would be interested in. Something for some new MA and PhD students to cut their teeth on, I guess. I mean, sort of springing off that, I guess, I think it's fair to say that the institutions of the US government, like the Pentagon, are worried about climate change. But the current administration seems somewhat less concerned, I think. I was wondering, like, how are leaders and how is the policy community kind of threading this needle? Like, why this disjunction between the political leadership and the institutional leadership?
Well, unfortunately, in the United States and in some other countries around the world, we've had increasingly divisive politics at the electoral level now for a number of years, which looks set to continue. But below that, where the wheels of government really turn, where things really happen, and budgets get put onto projects that actually make a change in people's lives, there is much more widespread consensus across policymakers, military planners, engineers, scientists, that in the climate era, we need to become more resilient. And that can take many forms, from shoring up our military bases to ensure they're better protected from flood and storm risks, to better arming our firefighters to be able to combat the increasingly long wildfire season we face out west. And it includes being able to integrate awareness and assessment of these capabilities in our international capabilities as well, as we see, for example, China taking advantage of a changing South China Sea to build atolls and claim that these are now its territory and expand its reach within this Pacific, ever closer to the United States. That is a concern for many. And climate change is creating these new conditions on the ground and in the ocean that others are taking advantage of.
Yeah, and I think just to springboard off that again real quick is, do you think that climate denialism and sort of people who maybe don't take it as credibly in the electorate actually represent a security threat? Is that something which security organizations and policy should be concerned with, or is that something best left to the domestic politicians that you mentioned? He says, asking, I know it's a very kind of tricky Civ Mill line to walk, but yeah, I wonder about kind of that field. Is that something which we should care about as a security issue?
Well, I mean, I think what matters for voters is different in different countries.
Of course.
The climate security connection in the United States has not been the one most front and center for enough voters, although it increasingly matters when our military bases are at risk along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast in Florida and the Carolinas. That does matter. But, this is all part of the larger transition to a clean energy future. And as we move our societies to a clean energy future, that has different near-term winners and losers, different depending on your energy sources. And the obligation of governments is really to see that transition through so that jobs are maintained, workforces are trained, and people have opportunities in the new economy, which I think is coming, but sometimes it's hard for some people to see and they want to hang on to the past.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, Shasti, over to you, I think.
Yeah, I want to follow up a little bit on how you mentioned water before, and even in your work earlier. Do you think water insecurity will form a part of national security and climate security strategies for countries and just globally in the near future?
Oh, absolutely. Water is really the front line of climate change. We know now that drought-stricken regions across the Middle East and the variability, the unpredictability of water sources around Lake Chad has led to fragility and instability. And sometimes it's not just the absolute decline in water, it's the unpredictability that is occurring in the climate era, so that farmers and herders can't count on being able to maintain their livelihoods as they had in past seasons because of increasing changes in water availability to support their livelihoods and to support their families. And in some regions of the world, for example, in Southeast Asia, water could consume large portions of Bangladesh between the flooding in the northern regions and sea level rise and storm surge in the coastal areas. Much of that country, but they're not alone. Many other countries will face this even in the US in coming decades. We will find that certain coastal areas will become less habitable, and we're already seeing people moving away from coastal regions. And hopefully there are some good signals that people, need to build back better in a more resilient way, that the private sector through insurance and other mechanisms send signals about what are the increasing costs of living in some of these water risk areas. What we need to do is really climate proof our planet. That starts both with lowering our emissions, transitioning to a cleaner, low carbon energy future, and also in providing for resilience in a variety of ways.
Right. And just follow up on that, do you think water insecurity is the significant, or do you think there are other significant factors like water insecurity that will contribute to strategic policies that will be built for climate security?
Well, I think water is right up there among the top risks, because for so long we could assume that most people could have the water they needed, and that's not true anymore. And so we end up not only with have and have-nots in society, but with water have and have-nots, and that provides breeding ground for terrorist and violent extremist organizations to take advantage of vulnerable communities and populations. Because at the end of the day, people need water to live, and they need water for their families. And so people will become desperate, and that leads to increased fragility.
Number of regions we want to discuss, which some of you touched upon already. One of the key areas of your research has been the Arctic. And I was wondering sort of what your elevator pitch for American Arctic strategy sort of is. Like, what should Washington be doing? If you had a minute to convince the president to do something, what would you tell him?
To deal with the real risks in the Arctic, the first of which is climate change, which is why we need increased presence there. The permafrost is collapsing, the sea ice is retreating, and the temperatures are rising more rapidly than anywhere else in the planet. That's given rise to Russia nuclearizing its portion of the Arctic, trying to convert the northern sea route into a toll road for shipping from Asia to Europe, and China declaring a polar Silk Road and itself a near Arctic stakeholder as it seeks a long game with ambitions of resources and shipping and economic influence across the region. So I often say in the Arctic, we have to walk and chew gum. I mean, it's about climate change, but it's also about great power competition. It's not one or the other, it's both. And we've kind of seesawed between those two in the US a little bit in recent years. And most importantly for me, what keeps me up at night in the Arctic is the risk of an accident. Because the region is vast and remote, because Russia has a very shoddy nuclear safety record from Chernobyl to the Kursk submarine sinking, and is increasing deploying nuclear and other capability across the region. There's more and more vessel traffic, including tourism and barge shipping. And we've seen these terrible oil spills occur, like the one recently in Mauritius. Well, what if we have a tanker break aground in the shallow regions of the Arctic? It likely will not be contained in any one country. We have a transboundary oil spill, which could make the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, which wasn't even in the Arctic, it was in southern Alaska, look like something easy. and that has taken decades to recover. We already have a very serious spill. Russia has a very serious spill up in Norilsk now with a diesel spill that is far from contained. So during the Cold War, even when we were prepared to launch nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union, we also had ways of communicating, from hotlines to early warning mechanisms. We call them confidence building measures, so that we could reduce the risk of miscalculation. So those types of confidence building measures become even more important in an era of low trust, which is where we are right now.
Yeah, all right, makes a lot of sense. And speaking of low trust, I think we should ask you a couple of questions about great powers and attendant low trust.
Yeah, I want to get into a bit of international politics and power competition. So, in your opinion, how does climate change relate to great power competition? Do you think it will upend any commonly held assumptions about international politics? So, for example, do you think it will aggravate impacts of the conflict of the South China Sea in its own way, or anything of the like?
Well, I think climate change as a threat multiplier is creating new risks, new opportunities, for example, that China is taking advantage of to build up islands and capability in the South China Sea, and also because you are vulnerable and may lose their entire land area or good portions of it to sea level rise, storm surge, or lack of fresh water, saltwater inundation, are looking for places to go. And Kiribati is a very good case in point. Kiribati Islands, which are about 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, part of the Consortium of Federated States, allied with the United States. However, they need land. They've been looking to Fiji, for example, as a place to move some of their population. And now recently they shifted their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. And that is very significant because that's giving China a toehold in the region in a way it had not had before. And we see increasingly that China is looking to be the provider of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and financing and debt in ways that could make many more free countries ultimately overly dependent on China for their economic and health security.
Right, right. And just in the same discussion, in the light of the same discussion, do you think there will be global cooperation without political interest for tackling climate security, or do you think climate and national security are very closely intertwined so that the separation of political interest is very hard from the separation from cooperation for climate security?
Well, if I understand your question, again, I think it's a bit, we have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to understand what the risks are and confront them and reduce the risk to individuals and communities. And at the same time, we're going to have to find ways to cooperate, even with adversaries. I think there are ways to cooperate on common elements of climate and security, particularly on reducing risks to military base infrastructure, improving early warning signals for military operating in regions, and combining forces for humanitarian assistance and natural disaster relief. At the end of the day, it's about making our societies more resilient. And the prerequisite for that is security. So we found in Africa that security forces are necessary, for example, prerequisite to improving resilience of livelihoods, water and food security in those regions. And that's going to increasingly be true around the world. I also find that militaries and national security organizations can lead by example because they're mission oriented and they want to do the right thing. And we've had from NATO to other security organizations, when they have the right mandate to either develop the great green fleet of the future or to reduce risks by cooperating with even for other foreign militaries, they're able to do that. And I think that's going to be increasingly important in years ahead.
All right. Another quick question, which so obviously some terrorist groups have talked about climate before. I mean, Bin Laden was very into climate change for reasons I don't fully understand. Al-Shabaab banned plastic bags, But I wonder if there's sort of, what does symbol climate change augment sort of extremist movements, both Salafi jihadism and white supremacism? And particularly, do you think they might use climate grievance as a recruiting tool? Blaming America for climate change, for example.
Absolutely, that's already happened. They blame the West. The West is blamed for causing climate change by being the largest, among the largest emitters. Now, of course, China is the largest emitter, but both compared to many smaller countries. And also, water has been weaponized and used by violent extremist groups against the vulnerable or as a tool of war. Now that goes back into history. There are many historical examples where water was withheld, or where, for example, the Mosul Dam was threatened to be targeted as a way to unleash the power of water, the weaponization of water against vulnerable people on the downstream side. So those risks are ever present, and those tools, the possibility of using those tools increases during an era of scarce natural resources.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. And then on to some more sort of theoretical questions. What do you think is the best possible response the US could sort of muster to deal with climate change and climate security? Like in the ideal world, perhaps if you were in the White House yourself, how would it be done? What was the best case scenario?
Well, the U.S. needs to elevate its leadership attention to climate change. Obviously, rejoin the Paris Agreement, and then include climate and natural security considerations across its foreign policy and national security in all its diplomatic relations, multilateral, bilateral, in international aid institutions, and in its security strategies.
And then the very predictable converse of that is, what's your nightmare scenario? What's the worst thing that could happen, other than, of course, a major oil spill or nuclear incident, God forbid, in the Arctic, which you already mentioned as being quite bad.
Well, I think we're going to find increasing parts of the planet uninhabitable, either from extreme heat or sea level rise. We've seen temperatures this summer rise well over 100 degrees, 110 and 20 degrees in some parts, both of the US and Southeast Asia and the Middle East, in areas, particularly areas where people don't have access to air conditioning or electricity. And that's either, going to fuel more unfortunate fatalities or increase migration to and that, of course, fuels the nationalist narrative that we've been in for the last year of mob at the gates, keep other people out, and that the human rights. Maybe since we're make this splice it together as a short, you have enough material now for to go forward.
Yeah, no, for sure, absolutely. I mean, there are a couple of moments there, but I think we've captured your kind of key line of argument, which is,
Right.
Uninhabitable, more migration, nationalism. I mean, one last question, sort of off piece, I guess, is what's the element of climate and security which you wish you got to talk more about? That the annoying interviewers don't ask you enough about, essentially. Like, what's your kind of pet project within the broader field?
That's a great question. Well, I'm now focused on broadening the frame to natural security. So climate is an element of it, but we need to think about all the ways in which we interact with the natural world and are disrupting it. And that includes loss of biodiversity and zoonotic diseases, some of which is a component of the pandemic and the spread of pandemic disease around the planet. Also, ocean health is increasingly important to our planet, not just plastic pollution, illegal fishing, changing salinity, changing ocean health conditions. We are a planet of mostly water. So that's increasingly important. As well, our station, our forests and other natural areas are part of helping us absorb the carbon that we need to maintain its health. And so that's also a dangerous risk that we face now with increasing loss of major forested areas.
All right, awesome, very interesting stuff. I mean, I hadn't come across the idea of natural security personally before, so that's worth looking into further.
Great. Thank you
Very
so
nice to meet you both, and I wish you best of luck in your studies. Hopefully someday we'll meet in person.
Absolutely.
Hopefully. Thank you so much for coming.
All right.
Thanks again. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.